combating gender discrimination and sexual violence in higher ed. We are here, and the three of us kind of entered the sexual violence survivor prevention, uplifting movement because of a law called Title IX. Let's talk Title IX. So this is the text of this passage, Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, aka the Patsy Takemoto Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. Patsy was the one of the co-authors of this act, and in 2002, after she passed, the act was renamed after her, but here on after, we're going to call this Title IX. So no person in the United States shall, based on sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this is a federal civil rights law that prohibits sex discrimination in education, both K through 12 and colleges, universities, tribal schools, community colleges, etc. So the statute is pretty short and pretty vague, but it has caused a lot of controversy. And I'm going to underline some of the portions of the statute that have been interpreted, debated, decided in Supreme Court cases, and have had guidance to clarify what this means and how schools can abide by this law. So this part, this part, this part, and this part. Basically, the entirety of this act has been kind of debated and interpreted, but the quick and dirty of the last few decades, the stuff that you need to know, and kind of what was the law of the land, or rather the guidances that had been really issued and really built upon, especially during the Obama era, were the following. So Title IX applies to students of all genders, all gender orientations, presentations, etc. Trans students especially, because we need to really focus on and remember the fact that sexual violence affects all of us. All of us are capable of committing harm against one another. But unfortunately, kind of the cultural stereotypes around sexual violence are very limited. They very much paint white cisgender young women as victims, and white cisgender men as people who are having their lives ruined by accusations. They often, paint Black men as perpetrators. And so what we are trying to say here is that gender differences don't cause sexual violence. Rather, power imbalances are what allows sexual violence to thrive. It's what allows people to get away with sexual violence. It determines who is viewed as a victim, as does race, class, ability. Sex discrimination, again, in that statute includes sexual violence. And a lot of these mandates and clarifications that have come down from the executive branch have basically clarified that schools need to prohibit sexual violence in their codes of conduct and make that very clear and communicate that to all their students, faculty, staff. During the Obama era, we saw the mandate of having Title IX coordinators on campus, having preventative measures, and clear reporting and grievance processes. So when you hear the words Title IX investigation, this is, over the last decade or so, this is something that has really kind of become a part of college campuses and a part of administration. And I think another important thing to highlight is accommodations for survivors during and after investigations, intended to keep them in school without extra financial burden and graduate on time. So some examples of that would be being able to change your classes without any sort of financial penalty or penalty in relation to your grades. Survivors being able to stay away from their harassers on campus, whether that means like a shuffling around of their work schedules, specific times for them to enter dining halls, that sort of thing, so as to not re-traumatize survivors and also kind of preserve their ability to get the full benefits of an education. However, some of the changes that we saw to Title IX, new guidance that was issued by the Department of Education under the leadership of Betsy Devos, and that's who's pictured here. And these are just a handful of changes that were made. I really couldn't include everything because it was just so pretty encompassing when the new rule was dropped back in 2020. So one of the things that changed was the definition of sexual harassment included the words so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. So basically what this meant is that schools didn't have to investigate or take action against discrimination or sexual harassment until it was like repeated incidences, until it was so severe and pervasive that action had to be taken. And if you are a survivor, or if you're someone who supports survivors, you know that one instance of sexual harassment or sexual violence is one instance too many. It shouldn't be so impactful that it is ruining your everyday for your school to intervene. Another change, schools can refuse to investigate sexual violence that happens off campus, even if both of those students are later on attending classes in the same vicinity, are part of each other's kind of social circles. One of the things that the new Title IX rules mandated was that live cross-examination in Title IX investigations. So allowing survivors to be really grilled on their experiences and re-traumatized again in a process that's meant to bring them justice. Schools are prohibited from providing supportive measures for survivors that are deemed disciplinary, punitive, or are unreasonably burdensome to the other party. So that threatens the ability for a survivor to, again, get their class schedule changed, or even better, get their harasser's class schedule changed so it doesn't impede on their right to an education, right? And then also a really big part of this is that under Betsy Devos, the Department of Education basically rescinded every affirming policy or every kind thing that was said about trans students. And that's really problematic. And we're seeing that playing out across the country right now in a lot of different ways. So why does this matter? Why is this important? Why is Title IX such a big deal? And it's important because it is costly to be a victim of sexual violence, a survivor of sexual violence. More than 40% of college students who were sexually victimized have reported experiences of institutional betrayal. So even when Title IX was a little bit stronger and a little bit of a better policy, students were still being discriminated against and pushed out of school. These next couple pieces are from a report by the national nonprofit Know Your Nine. So 39% of student survivors who were surveyed in this report who reported their harassment to their school are forced to take a leave of absence, transfer to a new school, drop out of school altogether. We have students reporting negative impacts on their grades. We have a lot of instances of students dropping out and being left with the loans and other financial burdens, as well as emotional, social, physical health, mental health. So this is a really important policy. It's important that Title IX is robust, that it is all-encompassing, that it addresses the needs of people facing multiple social barriers, and that also it kind of outlasts different presidential administrations, right? We don't want these rules and these guidances to keep changing in a way that confuses people who are really honestly trying to help students on campus. So that's kind of it for the quick and dirty of the policy. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to talk about us and our work. I am going to stop sharing as well so that you don't have to look at visuals anymore in this lovely lavender background. But one of the things that Betsy and Sarah and I were talking about when we were talking about what we wanted to kind of impart on you guys was words reset. One of the things we want to talk about is how we got involved in this movement and what has our journey been like since. So Betsy or Sarah, whoever wants to start.
Sure, I'll start. So I started into this work my freshman year of college, and I entered this in on the prevention side. So I was really lucky enough that my university had a student-led organization called GW Students Against Sexual Assault that was completely run by students. The school, admin, Title IX office, none of that is involved in it. Obviously, we worked with those people in order to try to make campus better, but it was our own organization, and we had peer educators that I led that had the goal of teaching our entire student body about sexual violence and the resources on campus. So that's how I entered this. But the longer you're in prevention education, the more you get interested in the policy and the advocacy of it all, because you kind of learn that you can't have real prevention until you have that policy to back it up. It's really hard as students to force people to educate themselves. So you need that, like, campus policy and state policy and federal policy be like, hey, you need to do this, and like, hey, um, you need this in place on your campus. And I learned a lot more about that at my summer with End Rape on Campus too, on how that works. So yeah, that's how I entered it. And that's how my journey went from education to prevention to policy. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much how my journey went into now being an education specialist at the Sexual Assault Center of East Tennessee. Um, so in this job, I do pretty much what I did in college, is basically teach people sexual assault dynamics and resources, with the goal of making it a more supportive place for people who experience sexual violence, and also preventing it too, but always support survivors too. So yeah, that is what I will say for now.
Thank you, Sarah.
I would say I got my start in advocacy in this field in class. I took a class in freshman year called 1 in 5, the Law, Politics, and Policy of Campus Sexual Assault, and it really, I think, electrified me and opened my eyes to this problem, which I naively think, I don't think I really realized the severity of it before college. But the course invited such a diverse array of speakers to come and talk about how they were working on sexual violence prevention. We had statisticians, we had nonprofit leaders, people from the government, journalists, et cetera, and seeing how a lot of these professionals had worked for their entire lives on this issue really, I think, gave me a really deep-seated conviction that we need as many different people as possible to work together to eradicate sexual violence. It's a really complicated task, I think, and it takes a while. But I think working with people of different areas of expertise definitely does move the needle forward. I think the class also opened my eyes to Stanford's own failure to protect its students from this issue. In 2019, we saw a survey, the results of a survey that showed that 40% of female undergraduates are assaulted by the time they graduate from Stanford. We saw similarly troubling rates of violence for transgender and non-binary students as well. And for my final project for this course, I looked at a sample of a few hundred movies that portrayed rape, just because I think that the media plays a really important role in influencing the public's responses to survivors when they come forward. So I can also talk a little bit about that later if anyone's interested. And then at End Rape on Campus, I met Sarah and Kimberly, who've taught me so much. And my main project was working on the school accountability map, where we were crowdsourcing information so that students from schools all across the country could populate this map with information about their school's Title IX implementation and sort of history, because that's information that can be really difficult to access for students. And then at Stanford, I'd say as part of the student government, one of the efforts I was involved in was getting Stanford to honor its original agreement to install a plaque in honor of Chanel Miller. That is an effort that was interesting because we weren't asking the school to do anything other than to honor its original agreement. But it did take almost 4 years for that to happen. And it's a pretty tiny, tiny plaque. But that was a win. And it's important to celebrate the wins, I think. And then another effort that I was involved in last fall was running this social media and email campaign to get our Board of Supervisors, some local elected officials in our county, to pass a motion to conduct a comprehensive review of every school in the county's Title IX policies and history. What we found at Stanford is that students don't feel safe. We don't feel like we have processes of justice and accountability that are available to us and that are working. And a lot of high schoolers in the area were feeling the same way about their high school. So it was really exciting to be able to mobilize with students from different schools of different age groups. And in the end, we did get the Board of Supervisors to pass this motion unanimously. And I believe it's the first county review of educational institutions and Title IX in the country. So that's a little bit about me, and then I'll pass things back to Kimberly.
Oh, I just love you both so much. Honestly, I was saying this to Sarah earlier, this feels just like all the kind of lunchtime talks we would have when we all work together. And so I miss that very much. And I miss that community that we had created, but it's so wonderful to recreate it now. Yeah, so a little bit about me and kind of my interest in this issue. So I experienced sexual violence, unfortunately, very early on in my college experience. Within the first 6 weeks back at school, it's called the campus red zone. It's when the majority of sexual violence occurs on college campuses. It's a time in which a lot in the fall, in which a lot of first-year students experience sexual violence. And so I had an incident of sexual violence my freshman year. I had an issue with a stalker throughout freshman year, and then the summer of my sophomore year when he followed me to a study abroad experience that I had in Canada. In my sophomore year, so I'd already been pretty politically active, but in my sophomore year, specifically, I joined the Women's Center, now known as the Intersectional Feminist Collective. And there I really found a group of friends and collaborators. At the Intersectional Feminist Collective, I found a group of friends and collaborators to really kind of talk about my experiences and begin to unpack them. I also took a course with Professor Jackman. I believe it was grassroots politics, but I've taken so many classes with Professor Jackman that at this point they all blend together. But in grassroots politics was when we read a guidance issued by the Obama era Department of Education called the Dear Colleague Letter of 2011. And that's when I learned what Title IX was. Because despite throughout my freshman year, confiding in staff at Salem State about my experiences, none of them knew to point me towards the resources that were available to me on campus. And as a result, I never reported either of my dealings with sexual violence. And so I never really did a lot of sexual violence advocacy specifically while I was in school. Like what stands out to me isn't necessarily any campaign wins or campus activities or programs. But what really stands out to me is the fact that I kind of became a de facto referral service to other survivors on campus. I think folks knew that I was becoming more outspoken about my experiences and that I was interested in this work. And I am so grateful that people felt safe enough to confide in me about what had happened to them and the violence that they experienced, but I wasn't really prepared to receive it, both kind of emotionally as well as not really having the training to kind of point them in the right direction. And I did the best that I could. I kind of encouraged students to report if that's what they wanted to do. I kind of walked them through what that process looked like and connected them to the Prevention, Education, Advocacy, and Response Office at Salem State. But it was very, very, very overwhelming. It's not labor that I should have taken on as a student, and I know that now. And so it really hammered home to me about why policy change and culture change is so important. Because I do think upon reading Salem State's guidelines and policies, they look really good on paper, but it's great that those things are written down, but they have to be put into action. And in order for them to be put into action, people have to feel compelled to do so. They have to understand how pervasive sexual violence is on college campuses, and they have to feel motivated to do something about it, right? So after graduating, I did my policy fellowship at EROC, where I met Sarah and Betsy. And I learned a lot of really cool things just about myself, but I also really importantly learned about the psychology of trauma, about what kind of changes in your brain and what kind of changes in your body occur when you're a survivor. And it really helped me kind of accept some of the things that I was struggling with in terms of just my mental health and just kind of how my brain responded to things that made me feel unsafe. As well as, I learned a lot about how to talk about and communicate and decode policy, because policy is often so imbued with really complicated language. And I really think that you shouldn't have to have a college degree or a law degree to understand policies that affect your everyday life. And so it's really important to me that like policy is accessible and understandable. And I really credit Ever, who was our supervisor, and I think they checked into the Zoom. So hey, Ever, how are you? But I really credit Ever to really kind of helping me develop my voice and my intention in talking about policy and making recommendations to institutions and legislators about policy. But yeah, I was wondering, I feel like, Sarah, I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate on, your experiences in Tennessee. It's quite a different political landscape than I think what a lot of Salem State students know and have kind of moved through. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit and what that experience has been like for you.
Yeah, it's very different of having entered policy in DC, which is kind of like the policy capital, really. There's so many ideas, and ideas are really welcome there of like how to make things better. Not that they always like happen, but there's so many good ideas. Here, it's interesting to see how policy and prevention interacts here. For example, we have a law in Tennessee called the Gateway Law that is literally a law saying what you can and cannot say as a teacher or anyone going into a public school. So you can't say like sex, you can't say this or that, you can't say anything that is against an abstinence only education. And it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild, and it really impacts how we can go into schools and trainings, because you have to be really careful about the language you use, or you're literally breaking the law. So this also comes into play of my learning about policy in college and at EROC goes into prevention and education of, if I didn't know how to read that policy correctly, I might mess up and say something in a school I'm not allowed to say. So it's really important, and there's some work in Tennessee when it comes to changing policy, but it's really hard when you're in the minority of trying to make a difference, because the political landscape it's definitely dominated by a certain perspective, and it's really hard to go against that for sure.
Betsy, I'm wondering if we can take kind of these last, I don't know how much time we have left, but I know we're going to move to Q&A soon. Betsy, I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate on your creative kind of projects and process. On the slides that I showed earlier, one of those was a page from a zine that Betsy created about sexual violence in the creative process. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more and kind of the film review stuff that you've been doing.
Yeah, thank you for plugging that. I did create a zine just because I was really interested in the idea of accountability when it comes to artists that we really have loved and really idolized over the years, when it's revealed that they've probably done something that is pretty horrible to another human being or a group of human beings. What do we do with their work? What do we do with them? And I think one of the central theses of the zine, which you can disagree with, I think everyone has their own opinion on the matter, is that you can't really separate the artist from the art, in my opinion, just because with people who are that powerful and that loved, your idolization of their art and everyone's collective sort of love for what they do does play a role in excusing their crime, their wrongdoing. So I try to grapple with that issue. I try to grapple with what I perceive to be a range of different behaviors. What happens when you compare every single artist who seems to have done something wrong to Harvey Weinstein, who is truly the worst of humanity. And it's a difficult issue. There's no one answer. I think I also wanted to argue that we have to take toxicity and sort of the idea of the crazy genius out of making art and making, movies, just because that is something that does privilege toxic and abusive behavior and excuse it. So I don't know if anyone was reading about like Olivia Wilde, who directed Booksmart. She has a no assholes policy on her sets. That's why she kicked Shia LaBeouf off her set. And I think that is just such a great way to think about making art collectively. No one should have so much power over another human being that they're allowed to treat them badly for the sake of art. I think that's wrong. So that's just a little bit about what I was sort of grappling with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Again, I've had the absolute honor and privilege of listening to Betsy talk about these things, and every time I'm just like, hey. I also wanted to take just a quick moment and share, again, kind of pop back to our slide. So we didn't really talk about kind of what's happening under the Biden administration. So this gentleman right here is Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. He was confirmed March 1st of this year. And I think this New York Times article was published March 8th. And there was also an executive order that came out of the Biden administration kind of denouncing the changes that Betsy DeVos made to Title IX, but didn't really do anything to change that. The rule is still technically in effect. And so kind of talking about what we can all do as students, members of campus communities, a few things that I highlighted, but I'm sure you can discuss and come up with even better things to do now. And it's kind of fortuitous that this talk kind of falls on the first day of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So kind of at the local level, your student organization, no matter what it covers, still probably deals with power imbalances and gender differences and racial differences. And it's really important that every student can encounter as much, like edification as possible. And so you should definitely reach out to the PAIR program on campus and kind of see what they're offering in terms of prevention education resources and just kind of broaden your understanding of Title IX. At the state level, and I didn't put the bill numbers in this, I believe the Healthy Youth Act, which is an act that mandates comprehensive LGBTQIA inclusive, age appropriate sex ed, which is a huge prevention tool, getting young people to understand the ownership over their own bodies and how to respect other people's boundaries is really important. And this act has kind of gone up in front of the state legislature a few times and passed the Senate last year, but it has been reintroduced, I believe, in this legislative session. So you can contact your state legislators and tell them to pass this act. At the federal level, there have begun a number of campaigns led by End Rape on Campus, as well as Know Your Nine, two fantastic organizations that we can't uplift enough, to contact the current Secretary of Education and demand that the Department of Education rescind, take away, strike down Betsy DeVos's Title IX guidelines immediately. And there's a real opportunity here to expand on some of the good work that was happening during the Obama administration. Those guidelines weren't perfect. And I think what we don't want to see a reinstatement of what we had before. We definitely want to build upon the tools and the resources that survivors had to, and that survivors had to, continue and complete their education in an equitable and healthy way. So I'm going to stop there and we can transition to Q&A.
Super. Well, first of all, thank you, Kimberly. It's so wonderful to see you here today. And thank you, Sarah and Betsy. Your talk was wonderful. Just for those who don't know who I am, I'm Cynthia Lynch. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Civic Engagement. And I'm so thrilled all of you are here for Advocacy Week, as we are doing this week. And what a timely, important topic that, that we are discussing, and you guys just did a fantastic job both sharing the policy perspectives and your personal stories, experiences, and professional endeavors with this. I really just want to reiterate something Kimberly said that's kind of the essence of everything I do, that policy change and cultural change must go hand in hand. I think that's one of the most important statements said. So with that, I want to open it up to Q&A from folks. Either you could raise your hand with the hand raising or put something in chat and I can read it to our panelists. Any questions from folks?
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, of course.
So just this morning, I was teaching my sexuality and society class, and we were talking about sex education, and folks were talking about how awful their sex education experiences largely were. And in addition to that, they were also talking about, both in the conversation we were having, but especially in the side chat, about really the horrific things that happened to them in high school, things that went, on sort of without repercussions, largely things that, were done by, straight cis men targeting, women, trans folks, non-binary folks. And so I guess I just keep thinking about how like college really, like we inherit those folks then, right? Like all of those folks. And so what are some things that, people can advocate for their college or university to do to not just like, reshape policy, which is obviously in that policy culture conversation really important, but how can folks advocate for more opportunities on campus to sort of change the culture and the conversation that we're having around, things like sexual assault, sex in general, consent, those sorts of things?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you so much. So this is difficult, right? Because there are people who have the perspective that sexual violence isn't the problem that it is. Not necessarily that it doesn't exist, but that people are over exaggerating the extent of the issue. That it doesn't have the kind of lifelong effects on survivors and their families and the communities that they're a part of as it does. And so I think what we have seen, kind of thinking we are in this moment in which people are kind of talking a lot more about their experiences, and that's great, but I would love to see a shift from getting survivors to share the most deepest and awful parts of their trauma and kind of shift that to conversations about like power analysis, right? Like I want to see more talk on college campuses, and I don't necessarily know how this will happen, but it's something that I'm interested in education that focuses on that focuses on identifying like the potential ways in which we can all commit harm against one another, right? Like cisgender men are often highlighted a lot, are highlighted a lot as perpetrators, and I think that is true, obviously. Like but it's not it's not like something natural. It's not natural or a part of the biological process or like a tale as old as time in terms of men being quote unquote predators or men being perpetrators. Like that isn't natural. A lot of that is like society and a result of power imbalances. So I would like to see more analysis that doesn't like paint it as something that we are not all invested in tackling. Does that make sense? I hope that was helpful at all. I don't know. Betsy, Sarah, chime in, save me.
I think you were great. That was great, Kimberly. So a bunch of questions have now come on. So I'm going to try to get to as many as possible before we have to get it, go to the next segment. But we will make sure that your questions get to the panelists so that they can answer them, even if it's not on this. The first one that I have is that I am currently working on getting a survey on the PAIR website where students can anonymously report that they have been victims of sexual assault on campus. This is only to collect more accurate data on the amount of sexual assault on campus. What do you think guys will think of this? And anyone can jump in, panel or folks from PAIR.
I want Betsy and Sarah to say smart things.
I guess I don't entirely understand the question. I don't know if Betsy and Kimberly feel the same way. I guess what do, like, are we thinking like what will men think of a survey?
That's how I interpreted that this is going to be sent around potentially to all students. Mm-hmm. And what do you gauge the reaction might be from men who receive it?
The question askers in the chat clarifying that they were just asking your opinion. Smart panelists.
Okay, got it. Makes sense. So surveys are great. I fully support surveys. When I was in college, the school sent out a mass survey to try to collect information, and I'm sure Betsy knows a lot about this too, more accurate information about the specific campus. There's a lot of struggles when it comes to this, when it comes to either analyzing data. For example, at my school, despite the fact that the survey was done, I think in 2017, I graduated in 2019, never knowing the results of the survey. And so they got all of these hundreds of responses, but we never got to know what it said. I think you have to be really purposeful in questions. A lot of people don't know necessarily that they've experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault. So you need to be specific about how you experience these certain things, or maybe an education of sexual assault and sexual harassment really needs to precede a survey like that for you to really get good results. But surveys are crucial to really communicate to people of how big the problem is on campus. Because honestly, I know Kimberly was saying how people think that we over exaggerate it when really we're probably under exaggerating the problem. So surveys can really help with that. It can be really, really hard to get good data on that for sure.
Thank you, Sarah. And I really agree with what you're saying about surveys as a data collection tool. It's excellent. I think I've time for another question. There's been a lot of talk about sexual misconduct recently. The recent 97% statistic has brewed a lot of discussion, but it has also brewed a lot of reactionaries. Any thoughts on how to prevent this?
Prevent what kinds of reactions? Could someone clarify?
Yeah, I'm a little confused on the 97%, like what that's referring to.
Yeah, that stat was done in the UK. It was some kind of survey about sexual harassment specifically. And yeah, it's all over the internet now, of like the 97% of women have experienced sexual harassment.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the thing with gathering data and statistics is that you're limited by the size of your sample. And you are limited by, the fact that people are self-reporting, right? So you can't definitively say that 97% of women across the universe have experienced sexual harassment, but it should provide you some great general insight, right? Like it should indicate to you that there is a problem. When I say that of the survey that in the report that Know Your Nine did, where 39% of students who reported to their harassment to their campuses have dropped out of school, that is a problem. That is indicative of a much larger problem. We may never know exact numbers, but statistics can provide us a really great insight into the volume of the problem, the scope of the problem, the types of people and kind of their life experiences that it affects, and maybe affects more severely, right? So I hope that helps. In terms of reactionaries, there will always be reactionaries, but I think one of the ways to approach people who kind of respond and say like, oh, this is an exaggeration, I would kind of ask them, why do you think that way? Like, what about your life experiences have led you to believe that sexual violence isn't as bad and that people are making things up? I think if you kind of interrogate that line of thinking and you do it in a way that's like open and honest and thoughtful and not, well, you don't know what you're talking about. It's really easy to have that reaction, especially as a survivor, that is often like, I just go Kill Bill sirens in my head. But really to try and it kind of interrogate that line of thinking, you will find people really struggling for answers, right? When we talk about like believing survivors, it's not necessarily like, it is a slogan that I think is very useful, but also very limiting. It's not just about believing survivors in terms of every single belief that they have about sexual violence, right? But it's believing that they are experts in their own experience and that you don't know what it's like to move through the world as they do, if that helps.
Thanks, Kimberly. Okay, let me go on to the next. This is great. We have so many questions. How far are we in the process of giving more protections to victims when it comes to sexual violence perpetrators going through due process? Also, what can we do to support this process and moving forward? As I know, it unbelievably traumatizing for victims to have been used as witness in court, and sometimes there's no justice due to the fear of reliving the trauma. And I don't know if Rebecca, if you want to if the asker of the question wants to clarify at all, or if you can go from that.
I think it's asking how is there anything that's currently trying to make the criminal justice system better? I think that's what's referencing more so than Title IX. And honestly, like, it depends on where you are. Like, some states and some jurisdictions just have better protections for victims of sexual violence in the process. But honestly, it's totally based on what jurisdiction you're in and how that specific court functions. It totally depends on where you are. I'm not aware of federal legislation that's trying to make that better.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Betsy, did you want to chime in on that?
Well, I think an important term here is being trauma informed and having practices that are trauma informed, whether it's in the justice system or in school Title IX processes. I think a lot of what I've seen at my own school that is not very trauma informed is sort of common sense. I think that when you make a promise to a survivor, you should keep that promise in terms of how long the investigation is going to be. I think obviously confidentiality is an extremely important thing, and sometimes it ends up being violated. That is something that would make someone feel very unsafe. So in terms of making the justice system and Title IX processes accessible, I think keeping your promises and being transparent about the process are really important parts of making sure that there is no bottleneck and that people don't end up dropping out in the middle because what they expected or the promises that were made to them are being broken.
Thank you. So important. Where am I? When we are doing advocacy to legislators, reps, etc., what are some key talking points or buzzwords about this topics that you recommend? I find sometimes it can be hard to start this conversation.
As someone who has lobbied quite a bit, it's really helpful to go in with like a fact sheet or just like a notes. You want to sit down before even talking to legislators, before making a phone call or writing an email. You really want to sit down and think about what you want to say. Unfortunately, legislators and their staff don't have a ton of time. And a lot of times you'll find that they're not necessarily specific experts in the one policy or issue area that you want to talk to them about. So you might have to hold their hand a little bit. You might have to kind of do some research for them and provide them with the information and the sources that have kind of helped you in your education. In terms of like buzzwords, I think it depends on what matters most to you. I think trying to go for language is really important. Trying to go for language that is very inclusive, right? So instead of necessarily saying, I want to talk about rape culture, maybe you want to say, I want to talk about sexual violence, because that's kind of a little bit more of an umbrella term. It's a little bit more all-encompassing of the types of violence and harassment that people experience. I would try to avoid framing it again as an issue that only cis women experience, that like only cis women are victims or survivors. Again, a lot of the stories that we hear, and we should honor all survivor stories, are about cis women, particularly white cis young women. But again, survivorship is very vast and all encompassing. I think like some helpful statistics. One of the things that I remember was a big thing as the 2020 election was going on is that 1 in 4 voters, registered voters, are estimated to be survivors of some form of sexual violence. And that's, across gender and race and ability lines. Betsy, did you want to?
Yeah, I think something that it is really easy to forget for a lot of people is that this is an issue of public safety, and it's an issue of public health, as well as access to education. I think people forget about that because some of these topics can be so controversial. So one of the things that I really emphasized when I was speaking to local officials in my county was that this is an issue of access to education for a lot of women, for a lot of non-binary and transgender students. And I really needed her to remember that, because she ran on the platform of supporting students and supporting women in school and education and in positions of power. So it is really about public safety. It really is about public health. It's really important to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Okay, this question is for Sarah. I have a question for Sarah regarding the policies in place where educators are not allowed to say specific terminology in the schools. I'm studying to become an educator here in Massachusetts. What kinds of resources are available for educators to vet through local, state, and federal policies, so that we know if similar policies are in place, which obviously this writer does not hope they exist in the districts?
Yeah, I mean, to be completely honest, if you're not in the South or not in a very conservative area, you're probably not really gonna have to worry about it. Most states don't have a law like this. It's a very kind of Bible Belt kind of specific kind of law. Also, schools and organizations have this kind of stuff on file. So you should never worry about going in somewhere blind about like, I don't know what I'm allowed to say or what I'm not allowed to say. And this will sound super basic, but honestly, just Googling sexual assault policies in your state is really going to help, or just sex education policies in your state. Yeah, resources like RAIN can be helpful. They don't usually have educator specific resources that I can think about right now. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. Wherever you go should give you resources for that and tell you what the laws are for you. And hopefully you don't have to worry about it.
Super. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to do one more question, and I'm going to turn it back over to Samantha to lead us to the breakout sessions. This one begins, I think this might be an odd question, but I don't think any questions are odd. But theoretically, would educating campus police about how to possibly identify situations where sexual assault has taken place or respond appropriately be helpful? I'm not sure if many people report them, but maybe I'm not sure if many people report to them, but maybe part of the problem is feeling comfortable with having a separate trained response team help people on campus.
Kimberly, do one of you have something to say about it?
Sorry, I'm reading the question again. My brain.
Basically, is it good? Will it change things if you educate campus police? So, I mean, that should be part of their training. I think anyone should agree that part of, if you're going to be campus police, you should have a training on sexual assault dynamics, because, I mean, police are people. They have the same biases that I think we all have about sexual violence before we began our journeys. However, they're in a really high position of power with that. So yeah, that should be kind of a basic level of training. I don't personally think it makes a big difference on campus. I think it's a lot more important for support measures to be really strong for survivors, more so than campus police, but that's my opinion. I don't know if.
Yeah, so I have very little confidence in the ability of police to handle matters of sexual violence. And that comes from a combination of personal experience and research. And I'm happy to talk about police and prison defunding and abolition with folks if they want to connect with me after this. But it's hard because I think even the students who volunteer to take on something like a response team, right? That's a lot of emotional, it's very emotional, it's very taxing on your mental health. And so I am wary of making students responsible for that. I'm wary of making anybody responsible for that. But I know what currently exists on campus, excuse me, is the Prevention, Education, Advocacy, and Response Program. That's a 24-hour service, aside from instances in which I think, they weren't able to provide services due to furloughs on campus. But that is a 24-hour service, and they are trained to kind of guide you through the process of, excuse me, responding to sexual violence, specifically on Salem State's campus. They are not as well staffed or as robust as I think that they should be. And so that might be something that you want to campaign for more resources being brought to. But yeah, I
think it's more
with sorry, Sarah.
Oh no, my audio was delayed, so I thought you weren't talking anymore. Go ahead, finish what you're saying.
Excuse me, suddenly my throat became so dry. But yeah, I think it's more about having spaces that are outside of police. I think that a lot of people, I think Black and brown students especially, just aren't going to feel comfortable.
Yeah, it's more important to make sure those police know where to direct survivors to those survivor-centered spaces, more so than training them specifically. But if they know where to send people, that would be great.
Thank you, Betsy, Kimberly, Sarah, and thank you to everyone on this Zoom. The questions and the comments and responses to questions have been excellent. I take time to save them and read them, because I think, not only the questions, but people's responses and affirmations have all been great.